Welcome back to another episode of Hungry for the Word. As always, I'm your host, Tommy Vento, with the lovely Julie Vento, as we continue our belief mini-series. This is episode 3 of the series, and we're calling the episode Moses's Wife, partly because I was absolutely enamored with this story as I reread it because at first I recognized how much I didn't understand it. Um, but as with everything in this series, it's another piece in the continuum that is his unfailing character and the requirement, frankly, the only requirement from us, which is to believe in that character, to believe what he has said about himself and what he's proven already through the works and the words and his prophets and et cetera, et cetera. And so the verse in question is coming from Exodus, but just before we hop into that, I'll say the subtitle of this episode could be the results of not believing. And I think it's important before we even start to qualify the fact that none of these individuals we're about to talk about or point to lived under the covenant that we do now. And so we do relate to him differently. There is not exactly the same, let's call it consequences that these folks had before what was accomplished through Jesus was done. And yet the purpose, similar to kind of that first episode that he doesn't lie, is more than anything just to illustrate how big of a deal it is to the Lord that you believe his word, how big of a deal it is cosmically that all of heaven and all of its beings, all of creation outside of us humans knows that his word is absolute. And part of the reason I think for the tiff between him and Satan was how much we didn't believe his word and still got grace after grace after grace. But as we kind of talk about the effects of not believing, is there anything you'd want to point out before we get started with some of the scripture?
Well, when we were just talking about this, I think that this kind of helps us understand his righteousness.
Mm,
He is a righteous God. And I think that this will help people understand what that means.
mm,
A righteous God does not lie. A righteous God is never not righteous. And
mm,
if you think of righteousness as harmony,
mhm.
it's never without harmony. So like I like the way you described that, the cosmic result of not believing or standing in his righteousness,
Hmm.
you're out of harmony. So
Totally. And this is another aside, but a good reminder. I think that, the word sin is a very loaded word, especially today, but kind of always has been.
mhm.
And yet I think in a lot of ways, our understanding of it is flawed because we live in such a shame and guilt conscious time
Mhm.
that in math, the visual representation on a graph of sine, cosine, and tangent is in wave form. And sine is, of course, spelled sin, and it is disharmony from the wave one node to the left of it. And now I'm butchering it. We should have a math guy on here to explain it a little better.
Yeah.
But to your point that righteousness is harmony, that all things in creation were harmonious in sort of a quantum 15th dimension way, and not believing him knocked all of it out of whack.
Yeah.
That's how imperative the belief in him is. And so we see that illustrated starting in Genesis 3, and then again several times again through the word, a couple that we'll point out today,
Yeah.
where again, to call it a crime on some level indicates the choice to commit it, which is both true and not true. We'll say fact versus truth. That in the realm we're in, separation feeling and seeming real, so too is our belief that we can choose not to believe him, to deny truth. And we have that free will. But like we're talking about, at the core of creation, it's impossible to contradict him and the I am. And so we will do our best to point out a few examples of in our realm the results, the consequences that you live in of not being harmonized with the cosmic truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that. And I'm also, think of righteousness as it should be.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I put that in air quotes because it's not the should as in you've got to do this,
Yeah.
but this is the way of nature
Mm-hmm.
as
Totally.
nature is
Mm-hmm.
is the
Totally.
definite is another definition of righteousness. So getting out of alignment with that is what we're talking about, the
Yes.
consequences of being out of alignment
Yeah,
with that.
exactly. Um, so the story that kind of kicked off this whole idea, Moses's wife, comes in Exodus chapter 4. And for context, there's kind of a couple of things that happen in and around this chapter where three separate times Moses doubts the Lord. First, he says, "Well, I'm a murderer." And for those that didn't know, Moses is a murderer. That this man of God that is the father of leading us into the promised land. Skeletons in his closet. And he says, "Well, I'm a murderer." And then he says, "Well, I don't speak very good." He's like, "All right, I'll give you Aaron." And I forget I forget what the third thing is that he doesn't believe in, or he doubts the plan. And so Exodus 4:24 says, "On the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him." Did you remember that the Lord tried to kill Moses? Like Moses in the reeds, Pharaoh, the burning bush, everything that had happened, he was just going to throw it out and start all over because of how big of a deal it was. He didn't believe him three separate times.
Yeah.
The
Wow.
Yeah, so and this is the verse that I didn't understand, maybe still don't fully, but I think I get a hint of it. But Moses' wife Zipporah, excuse me, took a flint, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses's feet with it, and said, "Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So the Lord let him alone. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood by circumcision." Again, to say that I fully get it would be foolish. There's there's a lot going on there, I'm sure, representation that I don't yet have the eyes or the ears for. But what I think I do get is in that moment, Moses's wife is making a call on the Lord's true character that transcends the disbelief in this realm. And that when we said a few episodes ago, he doesn't lie and he doesn't change his mind. But the only time he does change his mind is on behalf of mercy. That his first action was to give Moses 3 opportunities to believe him. After all 3 were denied, he makes the move to kill him. But the wife, who I think that the circumcision is, again, a representation of what's to come, our heart circumcision, the spiritual one that's taken place, as Paul says, that that circumcision, the blood that is spilled and then touched to the feet, the way that Jesus washes the disciples' feet, is making this call on God's character, that his love, his unfailing mercy, his grace is even greater still than his own justification for executing justice against the crime committed that was not believing him. Again, am I
Mm,
doing this
yeah.
even remotely
No,
justice?
yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
And so to know that the results, again, cosmically, of you not believing him is that before Jesus, it was as severe as, well, then I'm going to take your calling off of you. But his wife interceding for him in the same way that Jesus, our advocate, intercedes for all time for us to wash our feet, that we can wash our robes and, again, the blood of the Lamb, the covenant, to not believe him is such disharmony that it calls for a sacrifice of that magnitude to rectify it, you know?
Mm, yeah.
So, yeah, as we uh, ponder that story alone, is there anything else that sticks out to you, or any other verses that are in the same neighborhood that you'd want to touch on?
Well, I like again how you're saying the cosmic result.
Mm,
Oftentimes we personalize the result to as if there's cause and effect,
yeah.
like we experience as humans, I did this, so that happens. Um, but the cosmic results of being out of harmony and not believing him are it's not cause and effect necessarily. I guess what would be the
Oh, see,
quantum
that's
version of that?
interesting.
Yeah,
Because I was gonna touch on the idea of karma, that,
yeah,
our understanding, and I'm sure I'm still butchering this on some level, but karma is what goes around comes around.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
is, call it the whiplash effect of how all of creation was made. It's all created and interwoven into a tapestry, a web work, and a ripple in one area vibrates through the whole plane. And so disharmony with that causes the negative ripple. And that is still inevitable cosmically. And so, to your point, cause and effect, that our understanding, very Newtonian, very linear, if this, then that. And there's truth in that. But gosh, where is that? Maybe in Colossians, where it says, the Lord broke the authority of all of the darkness and all those rulers and triumphed in them over it by what he did, because he was able to nail to the cross what we did owe cosmically, because that is justice. We had set off on epic proportions disharmony that rippled through the universe. And he nailed that offense to the cross so that it could be forgiven. So that all the little sins, and again, who am I to say little? Mud is mud,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But,
yeah,
forgetting to call your mom on her birthday is lumped into the same forgiveness as Moses murdering an Egyptian, you know?
Yeah. But
Um,
I brought all that up to say,
right.
because when we're talking about this, I thought of the blessings and curses that are outlined
Mm-hmm.
in Deuteronomy 28 and
Mm-hmm.
29. Um, here, love the Lord God, and these are the blessings.
Yep.
Don't obey him, and these are the curses.
Yep.
And by the way, there's a few more chapters of the curses than there are of the blessings.
It is disproportionate greatly. Totally.
But again, we kind of sometimes personalize that and say, oh, well, I've got
Mm,
to behave so that the Lord does this to me, or if I don't behave, the Lord will do this to me. But
mm,
a understanding and a belief in understanding what we're talking about, the cosmic result of walking with him and believing him, is it's not him personally doing this stuff. It's just the result of you walk with him, if you will,
precisely.
and you will experience these blessings. And if you do not, don't be surprised if you experience these consequences.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%. And again, that I forget where it says it, and you don't necessarily need to find it right now. I think I might have it bookmarked even later, but um, it says, I want to say a couple times, but I think Paul in one of his letters explicitly says that, he still holds back from us some of what we do deserve. Maybe James
Mhm.
says that, in fact. And so the parable of the sower is, yes, an understanding of how the kingdom works, but sowing and reaping is how creation works. And if you sow evil, you'll reap evil. If you sow good, you'll reap good. And that's again karma. And like you said, there's what we've talked about before, what the Israelites misunderstood was that they tried to behave unto righteousness. And so it became a standard, a metric, a burden, rather than behaving from righteousness, what they already were. And so letting their behavior be a representation of what they already were. And so again, we're not necessarily getting off track, but to bring it back to, specifically the crime of not believing him. And I'm using that word again on purpose because if you feel any condemnation when I say it, that's the enemy at work. That when Paul says, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? How did you receive the gospel in the first place? By belief. So why now are you behaving to maintain it?" That it's the mixing of, I know you've mentioned before when you first came into the faith, one of the teachings that was popular at the time was the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. And so that leads us to mix the covenants that we live in. The covenant that we're under with Jesus now is so far superior to the Mosaic covenant that came through Moses, that the Abrahamic covenant, again, we've talked, I think I have my copy here. He qualifies you, such an excellent resource. He lays out the difference of the covenants beautifully in legal, logical terms. That first, through Abraham, he just decided to bless a nation and a people, and there was no rules. Not that the law didn't exist and his righteousness didn't exist, but them being blessed was not hindered upon that. And they took grace to the extreme. They were behaving really wickedly and forgot him. And so through Moses, he introduced the law and said, okay, this is what it's like to be like me. But then through Jesus, Jesus fulfilled the law and gives that fulfillment of it to us. So again, in the last episode, what must you do to do the work of God? Believe the one he sent. And so to rid yourself of what you're talking about, the curses in Deuteronomy 28 and 29 and 31 and 32, basically, to rid yourself of those is not to do so by your own effort, but to believe what he's done through Jesus has accomplished that for you. And that's why the parable in Mark 4 is the most important one, or Matthew 13, because if you let that seed be planted, you can go to sleep and it will bear fruit. That's how important belief in him is. And so, again, I know we said we'd get into a couple examples of it. I do have a few more thoughts, but what's on your mind at this
Yeah, go,
moment?
go.
Go for it.
I think the other example, what we were going to talk about, Abraham.
No, actually, we can
Oh,
allude to him, but the other main one that I'd like to focus on is in Luke 1, and it's the story of Zechariah, the John the
mm,
Baptist's father. And for context, he is a priest, um, and him and his order, as was the custom at the time, when it's time to go in to burn the incense and to, speak to the Lord, they would cast lots to see who would do it. And I think that there's a funny little lesson there that we think it's luck, the casting of the lots. And on the one
mm,
hand, maybe it is. On the one hand, maybe it isn't, because he was meant to go in at this time specifically when he did. And he gets in there, and here I got it pulled up. He gets in there and he has a vision, and an angel appears to him and gives him an entire list of things, a prophecy of what's going to happen with John and eventually Jesus. And Zechariah says, how will I know that this is so? One time. Moses got three chances. Zechariah gets one. And one little bitty question. I mean, think of how normal of a question that is. How am I going to know this is so? But the angel replied, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will be mute, unable to speak until the day these things occur. And instantly it was so. He goes outside and he can't even talk. He's motioning to his throat and with his hands and pointing. And they're like, all
yeah.
right, we think he had a vision, but we don't know because he can't talk. That two lessons I wanted to take away from this as we kind of wind down here. The first is, in fact, a tear did come to my eye as I was reading this morning. I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God and have been sent to speak to you. So somehow this being is simultaneously standing in the presence of God and is sent to this realm where Zechariah is to speak to him. He's doing both. So quantumly, these two truths can be overlaid.
Mm,
And he says, but since you did not believe my words, you will be mute, unable to speak until the day they occur. Kind of a painful irony, if you will. You're not going to be able to talk until after they've happened, just to show you how certain they are. And maybe that is 3 points. The third point, which will be fulfilled in their time. So these are two separate thoughts. He says, you didn't believe my word, but the word's going to be fulfilled. Regardless of your belief in it, this is happening. But since you didn't believe, you'll be mute until it does. And so I think as we get closer to Jesus, and I'm please, if this teaching is incorrect, we'll revisit it one day. But as we're closer to Jesus in the timeline, we're closer to this truth of this new covenant being fulfilled for all of humanity. And so while he didn't believe, the punishment isn't to be killed like it was with Moses, it's to be mute. That speaking is such a beautiful part of our human existence. And so the Lord speaks something to him. And because he doesn't believe, his power to speak is taken away from him. And yet, even in all that, I've already spoken it. It's going to happen. The words will be fulfilled in their time, even without your participation in it. But who are we to say what it might have looked like during Zechariah's time if he weren't mute? If he would have believed, what would the word say about him then? Now, again, I'm not
Mm,
questioning the fact that the purpose of that story is to teach us this very lesson, but what might have happened? And so, in that same way with Moses, as we challenged at the end of the last episode to maybe dive a little deeper into your own areas of unbelief, what might it look like if the word spoken over you already by the Lord, which is Ephesians 1, he has given you all the blessings, or Second Peter, every blessing in the spiritual realm has been given to you, lavished upon you. You not believing that word, you're under a new covenant. So you don't get the same curses necessarily. And yet, you not standing in the magic of that promise and that blessing and the fulfillment of it, one could argue is punishment enough. you
mm,
know?
yeah.
So yeah, as we kind of wind down what's coming top of mind for you in this third episode of our belief series.
Yeah, I once again, I'm reminded of pondering, nothing is impossible
Mm,
for him who believes.
hmm
Um, and and again, it's not like you to be afraid if you don't believe that, your life will be full of curses or, I mean,
Right.
that's not necessarily, uh, but the light side of that is just understanding how harmonious your
Mm,
life can be when you do choose to
amen.
believe.
Yeah, that's well said. And um, while I don't know him or the story personally, um, the story of Bob Jones, where he says um, he got to go into the courts of heaven with Jesus, and he gets taken there, and he's in the outermost court. And it's funny, this is a good preamble to the next episode, but he gets to the outer court and it's like paradise. It's like no place he's ever been. He can't explain how he feels. It's amazing. And then he gets taken a little further into the inner court, level 2 out of 3, if you will. And he sees these beings that are so glorious, he's like almost scared of them. He's kind of half hiding behind Jesus and he's like, who are they? And he says, well, those are people who have been martyred preaching my word. And right as he says that, another set of beings walk in, even more glorious and imposing. So he's like, well, gosh, who are they then? And he says, well, these are those who were martyred preaching my word and forgave those who killed them.
Mm,
And beautiful, right? But then he takes him into the Holy of Holies, level 3 out of 3, the innermost place. And the beings were so glorious that he screamed. He's terrified. He wants to leave. He's like trying to leave, and Jesus is keeping him there. And he says, who are these? And Jesus says, oh, these? Well, these are my friends.
mm,
And I think of the weaponization of the verse, depart from me, I never knew you.
mm,
That even to be sent to the outer court would be to live in paradise forever and ever and ever and ever. But to believe him is to be his friend, to know him, as you said in the last episode, to know him who has made himself knowable is the highest honor you can give him. So much so that those martyred who we put at the top of the saint profile list, that even those people are not quite as close. And again, please know that I'm saying that cautiously, that even that is a step below those who believed him, those who were his friends, and so didn't stop with what he said, but came to know him fully in his word. Or as Corinthians says, to know even as they were fully known, to no longer see in a dim mirror. And so I think it's important as we kind of wind down an episode that's maybe a little bit more ominous and heavy about the implications of not believing, that the invitation to believe is to stand in that holy of holies with him as a more glorious being than you can fathom, simply because you believed. So only believe.
Amen.
All right. We'll see you next time, guys.